I think about him when I fear for my own future and my own career, because my worst case scenario plan is like, well, I'll immigrate to West Africa and learn how to make pasta, and I'll make pasta for like the Peace Corps workers and the folks who are coming through the beach town. And I know that sounds ridiculous, but I think at the bottom line, we have to know within the core of ourselves that there are multiple ways for us to be happy and multiple ways for us to have a meaningful, satisfying life. And it may or may not have anything to do with technology, or it may or may not have anything to do with where we sit in our lives right now. And when we know, like deep in our belly, that we have that kind of existential flexibility, I think it does make these worst case scenarios a little bit less scary, because there's a parachute plan is what I call it. Like if the plane's going down, where's my parachute and how do I land on my feet? Even if that means that I'm working at Starbucks. I have a great disposition to work at Starbucks. I think I'd have a great time there, and they have healthcare. So I'm not above that. PhD and all.
I know that you work with a lot of entrepreneurs, and usually like tech entrepreneurs, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So then you're probably familiar with this problem, which is that like our industry changes really, really fast all the time. And it's pretty difficult it's actually pretty non-trivial to manage a career, especially web development. And because the tech stack changes so fast that you could get up to speed on something and then find yourself totally irrelevant, like almost overnight.
Yeah.
And this has happened in a lot of cases for people. For example, like Flash used to be a thing that the web used a lot.
Totally.
And I've had a Flash developer on the podcast where, he was a professional Flash developer. He worked his butt off to ramp up his career to be pretty well known in that space. And then Steve Jobs was like, we're not using Flash anymore. And so the entire industry just dropped Flash. I mean, it basically evaporated overnight. And that happens. That's a pretty extreme example, but to some extent that happens over and over again in a pretty short cycle. So a lot of people feel it's stressful to try and manage the feelings about that. And then also with this comes an extra problem where hiring managers, they have a specific list of skills and that they want people to have. And so when you're looking for a new job, or going out sort of exploring, and you look at these list of skills, it's virtually impossible to be the person that they describe in these skills. And so somebody else that I had on the podcast coined this term full stack anxiety for this problem, which is that you feel sort of this underlying anxiousness about trying to pick a set of skills that are going to be valid a few years from now and also be useful for getting a job, if that's what you want to do. There's other problems too, where like you're at a job and you're using a particular set of technology, but then that goes out of date. And so now people are less and less inclined to use that for new things. And so then your company's going to continue to use that because maybe they've made a big investment in this particular tech stack. And so, okay, I have to keep using this, but at the same time, I'm more and more stuck in this position. So then what happens is there are ways sort of that people navigate this. And that's why I've talked to a lot of people that have sort of successfully navigated this. So there's like the problem coping side of this. So if we broke it down into like problem coping
and emotion coping.
And so, in the problem coping side, it brings up other things too, which also have emotions that come along with it. Like, for example, most of the people that I've talked to that have been very, very successful in their careers, they do stuff like they work in public. They, contribute to open source projects. They speak. They go on to conferences and do presentations. They speak at meetups. They start meetups. They have a blog and they write things and they put it out there. And I think, yeah, that's a big ask for people too, for a lot of reasons. And, one of them is time, obviously, and, kind of commitment that you have to make to doing that kind of stuff. But also there's a big emotional barrier to doing stuff like that for most people.
It's super hard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that's what I wanted to talk with you about. It's like the emotional coping side of this.
Yeah. And has somebody given you that language, or did you learn it in your psych class or from a therapist, where we talk pretty clearly about problem focused coping and emotion focused coping as
Yeah.
two potential,
Yeah.
paths of reaction?
Yeah. So, I mean, for years I had a lot of really bad anxiety, and I had a therapist that I went and talked to. And well, so for me, and I think this is a common thread with me and a lot of my friends who, like a lot of the people that I interviewed, I have very strong problem coping skills. So,
Yes.
so the therapist that I talked to framed it in this way: problem coping versus emotional coping. And like every problem that I would face, which would cause anxiety or stress or something like that for me, I would then just deal with it.
Right.
I'm going to tackle and destroy this problem.
Find the nail, whack it with a hammer.
Yeah. And, that's great to an extent. But then for me, at least, it led to multiple cycles in my career where it would be, okay, I'm working really hard to deal with this problem. And then I just burn out and I can't, because that's my only tool to reach for, was solve the problem.
Sure, which implies that there is a problem that's identifiable and that is in even small ways controllable. And I think a lot of the problems that we really tackle in our lives that can really burn us out or wear us out or contribute to challenges in mental health are problems that are outside of our scope of control, which is really what you're describing when you're talking about high turnover in the technical world. Like you don't know when Google is going to change the algorithm, and therefore what you've built your SEO strategy on is no longer going to be effective, or you don't know when a certain language is going to go out of style. So how do you cope with things that are outside of your control?
Exactly. That's the question. And I feel like there are the things that we can do, which some of the pattern that comes up a lot in my conversations with people is when they do have something happens really awesome for them in their career, some opportunity presents itself. And I've actually thought about kind of inventing, having a gong or something whenever this comes up, and just bong, because people always say, I really lucked out that this thing happened. But then if you actually take a minute and okay, well, how did this actually happen? And you break it down, then you could see that it was luck. There's always luck. But then also they sort of set themselves up a little bit with all these other things that they did for this luck to happen.
Right. Most luck is 10 years in the making.
Yes, exactly.
Right. You were in the right moment at the right time, but you also had that 10 years of experience or learning capacity or relationships or something else that helped you to be able to maximize on that lucky moment.
Precisely. Yeah. So it's out of our control because you can't make something like that happen. But there are things that we can do, actions we can take, and our actions are in our control. And that might not equal an outcome that we can guarantee. But so but again, that's me focusing on the problem coping side of things, which is kind of my expertise. That would be my reaction to feeling anxious about my career situation. And I've been there. I've absolutely been there. Would be okay, I'm just going to go crazy and tackle this problem. But I think that there's definitely a place for not doing that, or a balance.
I mean, in some ways, this is a little dark, but when I'm talking with someone about something that they're anxious or afraid about, I like to play the worst case scenario game. So say that you've become an expert in a particular form of technology, which overnight, for some reason, completely unforeseen, has been absolutely put to death. Will never be revived again.
Mm-hmm.
That's a terrible situation for any professional to be in. But when you take a little time and play the worst case scenario game, often you can do a little bit of work to backtrack into some problem coping focused modes, whether it's wise to diversify your abilities or whether it's wise to, take certain steps that would prevent that from being a total annihilation of your career. But also, I think when you get used to the idea that so much of this is fleeting and outside of our control, there can become a level of contentment with that. And the fact that shit happens. And when you kind of accept that that's a possibility, I think from the inside out, you can begin to develop some kind of resilience. So, for example, I'm a clinical psychologist. I have a PhD. I've spent lots and lots of time cultivating a certain skill set, becoming licensed, developing expertise. And there have been times when I thought, wow, what if I don't want to do this anymore? Like, or something happens in my life that makes me
Yeah, that thought.
I don't want to do it anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Terrible thought, super scary. I've invested 15 years of my life in this path.
Mm-hmm.
But I will say that when I was in college, when I was a junior in college, I spent my junior year living and working and studying West Africa. And I'm super grateful for that experience because I was immersed in like a totally different kind of life, right? People from lots of different backgrounds than me. And I met this person who ran this Italian restaurant on a beach in a really rural part of West Africa. And this person was really happy. And I think about him when I fear for my own future and my own career because my worst case scenario plan is like, well, I'll immigrate to West Africa and learn how to make pasta, and I'll make pasta for like the Peace Corps workers and the folks who are coming through the beach town. And I know that sounds ridiculous, but I think at the bottom line, we have to know within the core of ourselves that there are multiple ways for us to be happy and multiple ways for us to have a meaningful, satisfying life. And it may or may not have anything to do with technology, or it may or may not have anything to do with where we sit in our lives right now. And when we know, like deep in our belly, that we have that kind of existential flexibility, I think it does make these worst case scenarios a little bit less scary because there's a parachute plan is what I call it. Like if the
Mm-hmm.
plane's going down, where's my parachute and how do I land on my feet? Even if that means that I'm working at Starbucks. I have a great disposition to work at Starbucks. I think I'd have a great time there, and they have healthcare. So that's I'm not above that. PhD and all.
Right. Well, I mean, it's funny you say healthcare because that is, I guess in some ways dealing with the change, like a major change in your career is similar to what entrepreneurs face when they decide to just drop what they're doing with their career and then start a company. And one of those things is, well, if I don't have this job, I don't have health insurance, and I'm going to have to figure that out. And that's a legitimate thing to figure out. It's definitely a problem.
It's a lot of research.
Yeah, and I think there are a lot of thoughts that might come to someone's mind. So I'm just going to kind of like play try and be the listener here and kind of guess some of the questions that people have or responses to what you just said about being able to sort of recognize that flexibility, that what did you call it? Existential sort of flexibility. Like there are multiple ways that I could be happy. There are lots of different ways that I could end up being happy. Well, I know one thing that came to my mind right away was, well, that's nice for me, but what about my family? What about my house? Like that's an extra, I know that some people are going to be thinking that for sure.
Yeah. I spent a lot of my life working as a trauma psychologist. So I've worked with and sat with people who have lost tremendous things, whether their house in a fire or people they loved. I mean, loss is like a big part of what I've done in my work and what's happened actually in my life in the last couple of years. And I think the thing that I come back to, which is maybe not deeply comforting, but is that almost everything is survivable. And if you're sitting there thinking, if something major happens in my career and it leads me to a place where I can no longer afford my home, I don't want that outcome for you, but so much better for you to get your wits about you, accept that, and move into an apartment and be present and happy with your family than to spend that time sort of running yourself ragged trying to fix something that's outside of your control. Like it's better to sort of like surrender that dream and make a new dream.
Mm-hmm.
And realize that like lots of people don't own their homes and it's okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it seems like what this boils down to is like maybe people not realizing what they're capable of dealing with in the moment. Like when you're thinking about it in the future, you feel like this is going to be unbearable. This is the worst thing that could possibly happen. And then, when you actually get there, then you know, I mean, it's sometimes maybe not when you're actually there, but sometimes later,
Yeah.
years later, you look back on it and you're like, why was I so worried about that happening? That
Right.
happened and then it was fine. Like I dealt with it. So yeah, that's so tough though. I mean, I've definitely
It's
had
super
moments like
tough.
that in my life where I can look back and say, why was I panicked about that? Why did I limit myself in those ways? You know, in terms of like career choices, honestly, I've definitely limited myself out of fear, you know, multiple times in my career. And looking back on it, it's like, wow, man, I was like 22. I did not need to be worrying
So
about this
worried about
stuff
it.
at all. And, you know, now I have that perspective and it was a lot less worry, I suppose. But
I think too, like having good relationships with people is really, really helpful here
mm,
because, if you have 20 friends, your friends will have gone through hard things. And so, maybe you got a buddy that's lost their home before or lost a job and then lost a home. Or maybe you've got a friend who's gone through a difficult divorce. Like the more people that you know who you have meaningful conversations with, the more resources you're going to have if and when you need to really dig down deep and try to sort of survive something hard in your life. So I think one of the most powerful things that you can do to try to make yourself crisis proof is to really invest and cultivate good relationships. Some of that's professional network. Some of that is just like people who will bring you a sandwich if you're in the hospital, or people who will, show up and do your laundry if you're in grief or depression or you break both of your arms. I mean, those are the kinds of things that are controllable. The amount of time and energy we give to relationships, the amount of vulnerability that we put in our relationships so that they're emotionally strong and connected, and those things are what see us through the really hard times in our lives.
yeah, I mean, now that you say that, that makes me think of examples of that in my life where that's been helpful. So many times where you have a conversation with someone and then you realize that, oh, they've been through this too. And
Mhm.
just knowing that somebody else has been, you know, at least in a similar place to you and been dealing with similar problems for whatever reason, that automatically makes me
Yeah.
feel so much better.
Well, it takes away the shame of it,
Oh, okay.
of whatever you're going through, right?
Yeah, that's right. That's I wouldn't have thought of it that way, but yeah, certainly because you feel like why can't I deal with this? I mean, think thoughts like that, like why am I having such a hard time dealing with this? It shouldn't be that big a deal. It's definitely a big part of what comes along with problems like this. And then someone else has similar problems, and you're like, oh, all right, well, it's a universal problem. I have a parenting channel in a Slack room with some friends of mine that kind of run their own businesses too, and they have and we have just a channel, and all we talk about is parenting stuff for those of us that have kids, and that has been the source of great stress relief for me many, many, many times where something is happening with my kid where I just feel like, wow, this is insane. I can't believe we're dealing with this, you
Yeah,
know, then I'll drop it in there and people will be like, oh yeah, that happened to us too, with both of our
totally.
kids, you know. I'm like, oh really? Oh, this is just a thing. Okay, we could deal with it. Yeah, it helps so much.
Yeah, and over, like the clinical research is very consistent in saying that the number one protective factor, the number one thing that helps prevent bad mental health outcomes when we go through crisis, and I mean like a devastating tornado or the death of a child, like really intense things, the number one protective factor is the quality of our relationships. We don't need to have a lot of people, but we need to have like 3 or 4
Mhm.
people that really care about us.
Which I kind of like this because even though it's an emotional coping skill, it's also most of our my listeners are likely going to be very
Yep.
problem coping focused people, and I believe that we're now giving them a task which they could
Yes.
work on, make some friends, like invest some time in really deep relationships with people. Put it on your to do list, and that will help you feel better about dealing with the rapid pace of change that we all currently deal with.
Yeah, and I will say, if I could, like, I think this problem shows up a little bit differently in men and women, at least as we've sort of classically understood them in our culture. And we do see differences in how men and women cope with challenges. For example, 75% of people who complete suicide in the United States are men. Like, that's a disproportionate rate of suicide and rate of mental health problem that often goes untreated and undiagnosed. And not to pathologize people or to say that, but I do think that, lots of us are socialized so that men are like, where's the problem? I'll solve it. And women are like, oh, let's talk about our feelings. And both are valuable, but I think especially among maybe some more tech-oriented folks that I know who are really good and adept at those if-then statements and really good and adept at sort of understanding coding language, the problem-focused stuff is so natural, and the emotion-focused stuff, you just maybe haven't had a lot of practice in it. And I just want to normalize that. Like if it sounds like, this is sort of bizarre, this sort of feeling language, like I get that. So it's a whole new avenue in which you can do some exploration.
Yeah, I mean, when I was dealing with my stuff and going to therapists and working on that, that was one thing that I thought about was that my job is to be really good at perseverating and persisting on solving a problem until I get it solved. I think that's a quality that almost all programmers share,
Yeah.
which is that like I have to just keep working on this until I solve it. And, that's a big part of our job, and that is such a useful skill. But then when applied to, for example, problems that are outside of our control, it just seems like a recipe for stress and anxiety. And then it also equals an imbalance in our lives in terms of we're just always focused on solving the problem. But then, yeah, this emotion stuff, we don't really have the skill set, or, not everybody, but like that,
Yeah.
there tends to be an imbalance, I think.
I wrote a book called The Entrepreneur's Guide to Keeping Your Shit Together. And one of the things that I wrote about in the book is an idea from another psychologist named Philippa Perry, but it's the sense in which we edge towards chaos or we edge towards rigidity when we're under extreme stress. And I think that problem focused way of being can sort of edge us towards rigidity. Like, I need things to be in a certain way. I need to take this action and know that predictably it will produce this outcome. And that, of course, isn't always the case and can really like create a lot of distress when we're feeling that way. So I think the challenge is then to like come back towards the middle of the spectrum and come into some more flexibility.
So being more flexible in the outcomes that you're willing to like that you're even able to see. Like if you're
Sure.
so focused on the problem, then you're not even seeing like the range of things. Is that what you're saying?
Of what's possible. Yeah. Yep. Yeah.
Okay.
And then, of course, some people edge on the sort of chaotic when they're in a problem. They're not necessarily strategically like, I'm going to produce this behavior to try to yield this outcome. There, it's sort of like the shotgun method of like, I'm just going to sort of chaotically do lots of different things and feel lots of feelings and be a little bit unraveling. And that is, of course, its other edge state. And so that's when you want to help someone come back to the middle and be like, okay, we need to get a little more organized in our problem solving strategies here.
Right. Yeah. Trying to find a balance. Like
Yep.
let's strike a middle ground where, yeah. I will say I do know people that are more on that chaotic end of the spectrum for sure. And to some extent, man, I've even seen people like that and thought like I'm a little jealous sometimes of like their ability to go with flow and just whatever and not really care about outcomes. On the other hand, then I've seen that that's to an extreme degree. It's problematic in other ways.
Yeah.
Like it has its other problems. So yeah, that is. And also it's really funny. I don't really know I don't think I know any programmers like that.
No, I don't either. Nope.
That does not seem to be a part of the culture.
I know a lot of CEOs like that though.
Really? That's super interesting. That's super interesting. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about we've talked about problem coping versus emotional coping and the sort of this full stack anxiety that we feel is something that probably from talking with you, I would say it's more of an emotional coping strategy would make sense here. But because there's so much of it that's out of our control.
Right.
But there are things that we do that you can do to sort of increase decrease the odds of just catastrophic change just blowing up your entire career. And I mean, okay, so first of all, you had I'll bring this up again. You had an idea about, or you had a strategy that people could try, which thinking about like the worst case scenario,
Yeah, a parachute plan, or the
a parachute plan.
worst case scenario plan.
Right. So I will say, I just wanted to add a comment about that because from a developer's perspective, the worst case scenario, it's man, if a technology gets the rug gets ripped out from under you, like Flash, nobody's using it anymore. Except that's not true. Like people are still using Flash. There's still people with Flash careers. Like it's not going to be. That's one thing that when you're feeling anxious, I think you tend to think short term.
Yeah.
Versus like, wait a minute, like this is not going to be a problem that's going to be like overnight. Like even when Steve Jobs writes a memo, it says we're done with Flash. He's still got like 5 years or so to like make a transition, and there are obviously people that lose their jobs, and that's a whole other problem, and that's super challenging. But if you're still at your job and you still have this work, and even then I still think, like, say you love Flash, you could probably make that a career for a long time if you're willing to work with like legacy systems and kind of reduce the scope of what you're willing to work with. So yeah, we've talked about that with other interviews like that. That's really the worst case scenario, is you're sort of limited in the number of companies that you could work for, but you could still probably make that work for quite a long time. I mean, there's still COBOL developers, which is a super old programming language.
Yep.
All right. So then some of the other things that people do, some of the people that have navigated these sort of moments in their careers successfully that I've talked to, they do stuff like talk at conferences. So
diversifying your skill set.
Yeah, right. So they sort of will say like, okay, I'm doing this at work, but the industry is sort of moving in this direction. You can't predict exactly what's going to happen, but you need to sort of like stay on top of some of these new skills. That is part of being a developer. You can't 100% ignore everything that's happening. You got to stay a little bit on top of stuff, stay fresh and up to date. That's true of basically any profession. So then what they'll do is, instead of just like going off and just learning a little bit about a new thing, what a lot of people do is they'll go give talks at meetups, and and that ends up growing their professional network, establishing a little bit of credibility. And there's also writing, but all of this is doing stuff in public and reaching out and making professional connections. And that is super scary for people.
Yeah.
So I know you must have talked with people that are afraid. It was public speaking is maybe like everybody is afraid of public speaking. I mean, it's terrifying. I'm terrified of it for sure.
It's a skill for sure, like any other skill.
Interesting. Okay.
It's something that you can train for and practice. I mean, I think the underlying thing between all of these different options that you're naming, one is they build your network. Two, they diversify your skill portfolio. Mm-hmm. So if you're a great writer, you now have a whole list of other options. If you're a great communicator, if you're a great presenter, a great speaker, and people know you as that, then that's you clearly demonstrating competence and a skill outside of your sort of hardcore developer life. So I think, if you want to be crisis proof, diversification is always a great way to go. And then relationships are a great way to go, both in terms of close connected relationships and in terms of your network. The number of people who know you and know what you're doing and know what you're about, they respect you, they know that you are, someone with integrity or are a hard worker. And I think those relationships don't always have to be cultivated with you on a stage. You can just be someone who's really good about checking in periodically with old bosses or old colleagues, or noticing, sort of paying attention to LinkedIn and noticing where people are going that you have some connection to. Those can enhance your life, but also do make you a little bit crisis proof when there's a big shift that's happening. I think a lot of us find our way in life because of who we know and the risks that we choose to take, much more so than like hard skills. I mean, you have to be competent, but lots of people are competent developers. Mm-hmm. Not everyone is trustworthy. Not everyone is able to deliver on time. Not everyone communicates well. Not everyone does a great job of following up. So if you can be excellent in some of those other things, then it's really easy for you to say, hey, I don't know this language. I know this old language, but I can learn this new language. And on top of that, I'm an excellent human being.
Right. So that seems to be, that seems to be the common thread, and how people end up bypassing the sort of crazy like list of skills that you must have, in order to have this job. It would be, well, I have established these other categories where I'm of skills that I have that where I'm excellent at that other developers, are not. And I've sort of established and built trust essentially because of a relationship or because of some work that I did, which maybe is another form of relationship, and so then that opens up more doors for you, because they're not just looking at like, here's your skills, here's what you're competent at.
Right.
It's these other things too that are also valuable. That's interesting. Never thought about it that way. So why do you think that people don't do some of these things? Like, it seems obvious that I should follow up with people that I worked with in the past and bosses that I've had in the past, and I don't. Like, I don't do that.
I mean, for one thing, I think all of us are pretty heads down on what we're doing. I mean, I know, like many of your listeners, I have a business that I run. I have 3 children. I have, occasionally I make dinner. Like, my life is really full. So unless there's a calendar item on my Google Calendar that tells me, hey, check in with that old supervisor or send just a hello email to that old professor from graduate school, then I'm not going to do those things. So maybe one thing to say is to put something on your calendar once every 6 weeks that's like whatever, general networking or follow-up emails, or some kind of cue to yourself to say, hey, I'm gonna work on cultivating my people right now, which is a great investment, but often we don't do it because it's not top of mind. So make it top of mind as a prevention strategy.
Yeah, that's obviously I should do that.
Problem focused coping. I think maybe one thing that's also worth emphasizing is for all of us, to continue seeing ourselves as learners, which is that we're often integrating new skills into our life or learning new skills, whether that's cooking a new recipe or woodworking or, having a hobby that even like is intellectually challenging in a different way than our day job. Because I think that's another thing that helps you, again, to know, like, from your inside out, from deep in your belly, like, I know that I am capable of learning. I believe in the sort of sharpness and capacity of my own brain. And that, I think, helps me to walk around with a little bit more confidence, in the sense that if I have to leave whatever it is that I'm doing, I'm okay to start at the bottom of something else, knowing that I believe deeply in my own ability to learn something new. And that is a superpower that I think provides some assurance when we feel anxious and stressed.
Well, that feels like that's confidence. Like,
Yeah.
if you have that identity of yourself as a learner and have a history, obviously, if the people listening to this are professional developers, they're learners. They've learned a difficult skill and already made a career out of it. And so that's something which you could take that and apply to other things, anything that you needed to. If you, again, also have that sort of resilience that comes from accepting a whole range of outcomes and ways that life could happen, and being willing to go with that, it sort of frees you up from the worry about needing to have a particular outcome in your career, and like holding on to whatever you have right now, like that mindset plus that sort of resilience that you mentioned earlier. So I did remember what I wanted to ask you. The one thing I'm worried about, and this kind of it's related to what we were just talking about with having like a learner mindset, is that I'm interviewing people that have had very successful careers, which for me has been inspiring and makes me feel motivated, to know like, oh, look, I can do this too. Like, look, what I've tried to do is to distill it to like things they actually did. One thing I worry about though is most of these people, their careers are pretty exceptional. And I worry that it could easily backfire, and someone listening could feel like, oh, I could never do this. This is impossible. How could I possibly be like this person and do all of these things? And I would hate to introduce that, those like thoughts and feelings to people. So what are ways that I could, sort of present this to people? And what are ways that I can encourage people to think about, when we're listening to these interviews with other people that have been very successful?
I think we have to be careful about how we define success. I think often the people that we hold up as heroes, whether it's Elon Musk or the founders of Uber or like from the outside, it all looks shiny and nice. But from the inside, their lives can be chaotic and terrible. Again, having worked with a lot of high performers as a psychologist, I work with people who, you and your listeners may know their names and look up to them. And I know that there's other stories at play. So never like mistake financial outcome or prestigious accomplishments for a good life is something that I would say.
Mhm.
And if you can have a great family and make a great living and like spend your January in Florida for a week, there are lots of great ways to have a good life, and it is up to each one of us to do the work to define that for ourselves and to do the work to decide what we really want. Because once we set sort of 2 or 3 like deep goals for our lives, those are accomplishable. But, I think the aspirational tales are often a little bit of sort of headline or a little bit of, I don't know, inspiration porn. Like they're real-ish, but they're not really real.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do. I have tried in the interviews to just people tend to say the highlights of what
Sure.
happened. I have tried to get people to say how they were feeling when it was happening, which is
Yeah.
a tough question because I'm thinking, maybe that would help if we could see like, look, they also faced this horrible problem. And not only like they did deal with it, but also in the moment, it was really tough. It was super tough for them too. And that's something, if you end up facing that problem, you should know like it's not almost nobody's dealing with these things perfectly ever, then
Right.
it's like the outcome is it's already been a couple of years, it's been years since this happened and they figured it out and they moved on and they're probably like what I was talking about earlier, they look back on it and they're like, wow, why was I so worried about that, and now I could see how this worked out, but like that seems to be the pattern that people have.
And there's a survival bias, right? It's the
Mhm.
people who are still developers or who are still working in the tech field.
Yes.
So you may not find those people who decided to walk away and quit and have an Italian restaurant in West Africa. Like you may not encounter them, but their stories are also interesting and phenomenal. I think sometimes quitting and doing something different, we don't always honor that, but it can also lead to a really good outcome.
Yeah, that is a great idea. I definitely need to talk with people like that so that we can get that perspective too. And going back to what you were talking about earlier and having like being able and willing to see a wider variety of outcomes and willing to accept and sort of surrender to these wider variety of outcomes. So thank you so much for doing this
Yeah.
interview. I think you mentioned a book. Can you mention that again? Because even though it's for entrepreneurs, I think it's relevant to people.
Yeah, so I host a podcast called Zen Founder, which talks about all things mental health and family life. For it really started for entrepreneurs, but there's a lot of software overlap because my husband is a long-term software guy. And then I wrote a book called The Entrepreneur's Guide to Keeping Your Shit Together, which is sort of my attempt at like a nice, concise mental health manual for busy professionals. So those are a couple of resources that are free or inexpensive and on Amazon or wherever books can be found.
Yeah, that's perfect. And I love your podcast. I've listened to your podcast a few times
Thanks.
over the past couple of years.
Cool. My pleasure. Thanks, John.